Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Behind the Human. I'm your host, Mark Champagne, and it's my job to unpack the stories and mental fitness practices of people living at the top of their game personally and professionally. Today, we have Forrest on the show, who's the CEO and co-founder of Kineon. Am I saying that properly? Kineon?
Yes.
Kineon,
From the Greek base of kineo, for movement.
Ooh, I love it. Juicy already. Amazing. It's a medtech company revolutionizing red light therapy with wearable FDA-registered devices. With over 20 years of experience in startup creation and scaling, particularly in Asia, Forrest combines his background as a former extreme athlete, his fluency in Chinese, and his expertise in light-based technologies to lead Kineon's mission to improve quality of life through innovative pain relief and healing solutions. Does that sound about right?
That sounds perfect. We're a mission-driven company. We're here to help people kind of get out of pain and back into what's possible.
Sounds pretty damn good to me. Welcome to the show, brother.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time with me today.
So if we strip away all the bio, the titles, and all that stuff, who are you?
I actually, there's a number of different answers for that. There's the family version, there's the work version, there's the kind of personal version. I think,
give them all. Yeah.
Sure. I'm a long-term expat. I was in China for almost 20 years. I've been in Mexico for almost 4. Father of 2 children, 2 boys, and 9 and 5.
Okay.
And
I've got 3 and 8.
Oh wow, a really heavy kind of crossover. That's awesome.
Yeah.
We're actually trying to kind of apply with them a number of different things that we've learned. But I would say, I'm also from a professional and kind of just even my personal and hobby time is in essentially medical research around different tools for optimization. And I think that's kind of bled into both professional and personal sides of the life. I think one of the things is that we see these days is we're all a bit of the N equals 1, right? We've all got a number of different tools we can use, and it's great to see what's coming around from a development standpoint relative to health span, lifespan, strength, mental fortitude, and robustness. And we spend a lot of time in this from a technology and research standpoint, and really try to apply it, test it, and then apply it on a personal and family and friends and users now from our devices as well. So maybe a technology enabler for people who'd like to kind of improve health and wellness.
Ooh, I like that. Technology enabler. I like that. I'm so curious. Like, how did you go from the leather industry in China to what you're doing now? And I'm equally interested in understanding that, that chapter of your life and how it's actually helped you in terms of what you're doing right now, Kineon.
I think it gave me a huge amount of exposure from I've set up and run manufacturing facilities and done relatively creative things and innovative things with those in a supply chain that's built for commodity. And I think that's one of the things that's carried over with what we're doing right now is how do you bring down, with Kineon, we've taken the approach of how do I take something that's essentially, $30,000 to $50,000 lasers and make it something that's sub $500, and from a supply chain and design standpoint, really build this into what people can adopt from a home use and ongoing use standpoint. But from leather, I think I was an athlete most of my life, and then I started building businesses from my early 20s, and much of Chinese business centers around hosting, drinking, smoking, really kind of not fantastically healthy activities. And I looked up and I was okay commercially and financially in my mid-30s. But if I looked at my body, I was just destroyed from having taken so poor care of it over the decade prior to that. And so that really started me on a journey to be able to kind of turn that around. How do you take, when you've been an athlete your entire life and now your body is not in that space, how do you take that and turn it around in the most time effective way that still allows you to kind of build businesses or really do what your passion is, and still take the time on a daily basis? Because what we found across all the modalities we're using is, there's nothing that you get results from without consistency. And so how do you build a kit of the right tools, whether it's training, diet, supplements, or additional technologies that you can use to be able to turn these things around and really both take a better path, but also measure that path so that you can see that on a day by day basis, it's not something that you're steering into or deluding yourself about the outcomes for it. We really like to kind of measure the outcomes and hold ourselves accountable because it comes back to that same old Peter Drucker kind of management term of and this is paraphrasing, but what gets measured gets done. And so really introducing measurements in and using yourself as an experiment seems like a good way to build a better meat machine to drive around it.
I love it. So for you, because I mean, I think a lot of people can relate to I guess the place you found yourself in, where somehow, I mean, not somehow, I mean, you kind of explained how it happened, but often it's like a certain amount of time goes by, and it's like, how did I get to this place? Like, how did my health, drop off? Like, I don't even look like the same person anymore. Like, and so it can be heavy, right? Like it can be a lot to deal with depending on whatever your circumstances. For you personally, what were some of the kind of starting changes that you made to kind of get back on track and then obviously get to the point where, you're at right now?
I think the main thing was I wanted to find good proven modalities that had scientific research behind them to be able to kind of rest on. Because if I'm going to spend my time doing these and be consistent in the execution, I want to make sure that the outcomes are in line. And there's some things you can do from a training standpoint. So getting back into strength training, resistance training is a great one. One of the things that we really didn't have though when I was really kind of strength training and kind of training for sports as I was younger is the idea of metabolic training and training
So
yourself.
what's that?
So essentially, measuring you have a number of different bioenergetic systems in your body, and the two primary ones that we think about with metabolic training are aerobic and anaerobic training. And so being able to baseline those and then set kind of goals both long term and then these step function short term goals to be able to achieve those relative to the measurements for aerobic and anaerobic fitness. And so with just to put a little bit more kind of flavor on that, the aerobic you typically see more highly correlated with endurance sports. So running, rowing, cycling, long distance swimming, Ironmans, triathlons, this type of thing. And then you think of the anaerobic fitness and that kind of metabolic function more around sprinting or kind of high intensity interval training or
Okay.
CrossFit. There's high rocks. There's a number of different kind of training modalities that really support this. But the science that's as I started digging back into it again in my mid 30s, the science that had developed around this over the kind of 10 to 15 years that I had been kind of out and away from training for competitive sports was really powerful, and it's a bit of a rabbit hole to go down in, but there's just so much more data around this. And then the I think the one thing that you can train for both of those for competitive sports, but for me I was no longer playing super competitive sports. I was playing city level rugby at the time, which is
Okay.
I still try to keep up with just to kind of measure. It's a bit of a measure of robustness to be able to kind of take that abuse and still be able to recover through it. But the the training that I was looking for was really something that supported neurological benefits as well. And so there's a number of different neurological benefits you can find from both of these types of training. And then how do I create a program around kind of both the neurological and then kind of broader physiological performance benefits that I can find from this training that give me the kind of Pareto principle 80/20. So how do I put the 20% of time in and get 80% of the results? And so, essentially I've spent more or less the last 10 years steering into that kind of approach of let's take the highest leverage approach we can, but let's measure it and let's kind of set goals that we can work towards longer term with that as well.
So let's steal your 10 to 15 years of research, and again, I know that everyone's different, so I put that caveat here. But for you personally, what were some of those exercises or routines that you found had the best results on what you were measuring, and what were you measuring? Are you measuring like HRV and like those kind of measurements or something else?
So there's a number of things you can measure. I've found VO2 max is a very effective one.
Mm.
So I do kind of interval training and zone two training, I can kind of go to those, but those are kind of good foundational methods to improve your VO2 max, which is essentially how much a good cardiopulmonary kind of measurement for how much oxygen your body can turn over. Um,
Yeah.
and then I actually have a very good friend who I'd love to introduce to you, who has a kind of a paradigm shift in his writing about this relative to bioenergetics. But I think there's HRV is great from a recovery standpoint.
Yep.
But if I go do an extremely intense training today, I'm going to, and you could do blood work with this as well. So I'm going to spike my cortisol. I'm going to drop my HRV, and my central nervous system is going to freak out a little bit. It's when you're doing relatively heavy levels of high intensity work. This is one of the ceilings that we find for this is how your autonomic nervous system responds to this and puts you in. Many people, high level athletes have a hard time sleeping and develop anxiety and ruminative thoughts. And these are just a few different metrics that are measured in the medical literature for this, but that from this overtraining. And so there's kind of a set level of increase that you can handle from a super heavy intensity training for your anaerobic system specifically. For the aerobic, it's a little bit easier. You can kind of do, again, like I mentioned, kind of zone two low intensity running, and then intervals to be able to improve that. But when you're trying to increase things like power generation was another one that I chose on the anaerobic side. And so
How do you track power generation?
uh, so um, there's a couple of different ways. One is if you're doing resistance training, you can use things that are kind of explosive movements,
Okay.
and there's been a great amount of research in this recently about things like power cleans is a great movement for being able to measure just kind of a solid power generation. And one of the things you see with this, though, is if you combine it with there's a number of different products in the space right now that use either optical recognition or IMUs to be able to measure the velocity of. So the weight of the bar
Yeah.
of the barbell that you're lifting, and then if you measure the velocity, then you have a good foundation for calculating or deriving your power generation out of this, and that's one of the methods. And then the other one is kind of shorter term training on cyclical movements, like whether it's rowing or cycling or ski erg or a number of different things like this. Power generation from a wattage standpoint over time. And
No
so
way.
how much power, literally how much power are you generating with your movements through those cyclical type of movements, and then working with short term burst training to be able to increase that. Um, there's also things like countermeasure jumps and that are used quite frequently in the medical literature for this from a power generation standpoint. But it's it really depends on kind of what fits for you. And I think you nailed it. Everyone, I try to think of myself as an N of one. So even when you see a paper that has 300 people that have experienced this same power level increase, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work for you. It just indicates a higher probability that it can.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point. And I think, just knowing a bit of the audience here, I mean, just everyone here listening for the most part is, motivated to improve mentally, physically, and spiritually as well. So we're probably a little less I mean, I'm not wearing it right now. I'm actually taking a break from Whoop. I was using Whoop for over a year and so forth. And I'm running my own little experiment of just going to listen to the body
Yeah.
and see, how I feel when I wake up, and like just intentionally check in, but I also know I've got a good year of data that, like, okay, I know if I eat at this time or, do this, it's going to have an effect here, and here as an example. I only share that just because I think of everything that you're saying. There's so much beautiful technology and ways to measure, which is fantastic. But also, I think just whatever that looks like, if you're going into the gym and you're doing some sort of power training, like what's your baseline, in the sense of like what can you lift or push weight wise or reps, and we don't have to overcomplicate it, and just try to see the progress and be consistent and so forth. um and or if you're really into all of the tech and so forth, which I also am. It's fun to really go granular, and I think that the key is like the progress, like seeing the progress, right? And that typically links and motivates us.
No, it's exactly right. I think it's it's one of the things you see driving people's maintenance and consistency with programs is um, understanding what the outcomes they're going to see are, and then seeing those
Yeah.
outcomes. So when you know what you should do and you know what you should get out of this, then it's easier when you're kind of putting the time and effort in to be able to do it. But I think. You're exactly right about the sense as well. Like there's a number of different subjective measurements and we find that from a company standpoint as well. It's been frustrating, but it's what's there for us to measure. We make a wearable laser device that reduces inflammation and
Hmm.
inflammation based pain. And so, our mission as a company is to increase the quality of life for the largest number of people we can in the most measurable way we can. And when you have objective measurements, it's it's
Yeah.
it's more is more exciting from a technology standpoint, but the subjective measurements. So, as an example, with pain, pain, like the gold standard for this is this kind of like frowny face to smiley face spectrum, which is like this is what the medical
So
community is
articulate.
with. Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's but there's so many pain is a multivariate kind of measurement, and so when you look at trying to measure it directly, you can't ignore the subjective, and I think this is something that people kind of lose in their need or kind of desire to have objective measurements for things from a training standpoint. And there is a powerful amount of kind of indicative use that we can find out of subjective measurements as well, whether it's the visual assessment score with our pain or things like RPE, which is a measure, a kind of sensory measurement of like how difficult a training session is, or how difficult a set of movements is. And so,
Yeah.
definitely don't steer away from these things from a subjective standpoint. I think the idea of checking in and really kind of understanding those more comprehensively with a kind of a meditative approach for this sounds super useful.
Interesting. Okay, I do want to talk about or spend a good amount of time just on the general topic and correct me, like I don't know the terminology here, but like is it laser technology? Is it red light therapy? Is it near infrared? Like what there's so here's my thing, and I think people listening also are many would fall in this camp. Like we hear a lot about it. Many of us, I think, use various products and whatnot, and we're curious in kind of an experimentation way. I mean, I've personally felt the benefit of your products and others as well in using it, but I'm also still like, well, what happened to there's also so much talk about like cold plunge and we're used to like the icing uh uh narrative from like I just remember from when I was playing sports. It's like I don't think I ever heard of heating anything up, which I think there's some controversy around that as well. I feel like that what was that whole acronym, was it rice
Right.
yeah, but apparently that's like completely wrong or something like that. Anyway, I'm blabbering. Where in present day, like kind of where are we at, and how should, like what questions should we be asking or thinking about when it comes to our physical recovery of really anything that we're doing, whether we're an athlete or just we just want to make sure that we are able to move and have a good quality of life as we age, and be able to get up and down and all that kind of stuff and do the activities we want to do. Where does where does like red light and laser therapy and all that, like where does it all fit in?
It's a great question, and I think it's a funny one for me as well because it's also it's this question of red light therapy versus low-level laser therapy versus photobiomodulation has been something we've been kind of seeing in the literature between different groups who like different terms.
Yeah.
About 7 or 8 years ago, they did come to a standard for general light therapy being called, from a medical standpoint or research standpoint, photobiomodulation. So photo,
Okay.
light, bio, kind of your physiology, modulation, some kind of changes. So how are we changing your body with light? Before that, typically was split between kind of RLT, red light therapy, and low level laser therapy. What we're finding
Okay.
now, though, is that and I'll kind of give you the broad kind of take on this, and then
Yeah.
we've done as a company to kind of um, to do what we feel will give us the best and our users the best outcomes. Um, what we've seen from this generally is that is laser therapy or photobiomodulation is dosage driven from an outcome standpoint. And so you have photoacceptors in your body. And I can give you a couple of examples of those. And one of the ones that would be, an easy one because it's very intuitive that we know about is melanin. So you have melanin in your skin,
Okay.
and it changes and triggers different signaling in your body based on a specific wavelength that it gets triggered by. Uh, that one is one where you see kind of skin level adaptations, but those aren't really useful for you from a inflammation reduction or kind of oxidative stress or from a healing and recovery standpoint. So the ones that
Okay.
actually do help, and there's a number of kind of more marginal ones. So I'll steer into the ones that are more broadly available in your body and are kind of drive better outcomes because that's really what we're targeting. Um, Hemoglobin is a carrier molecule in your body, in your blood, that has typically, until recently, been thought of as carrying oxygen primarily. In our what we think we're in kind of the middle of a paradigm shift from kind of a two gas cardiopulmonary system thinking of kind of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Oxygen to kind
Okay.
of fuel your cells, and carbon dioxide out as waste is kind of what. At least I'm probably showing my age here a little bit, but this is what we kind of grew up learning in chemistry class and biology class in school. What we think of it as now is kind of a three gas system with oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nitric oxide. And hemoglobin is a carrier molecule for nitric oxide and oxygen. So,
Okay.
and it is very kind of widely spread through your body because blood is widely spread through your body. So what we do when we use infrared, particularly the 808 nanometer wavelength of infrared, we trigger the dissociation of nitric oxide from four different binding sites on hemoglobin. And those binding sites are competitive between oxygen and nitric oxide. So you dump nitric oxide, you now have an open oxygen kind of pickup area. And when you dump
And it
nitric oxide,
reduces inflammation. Is that what's happening essentially?
this so this is part of that. One is
Okay.
you deliver more oxygen to the areas, the potentially inflamed areas, so that you can remove that as a bottleneck from an energy generation standpoint. Um, the other one is that you're dumping nitric oxide into the blood, and nitric oxide, and particularly S-nitrous ethyl, and a couple of different kind of variants of nitric oxide are taken up by your cardiovascular endothelial tissue, so by your blood vessels, and it's a dilating factor. So it opens up the blood vessels when you're applying this. So
Mm.
when we trigger it, for example, there's a new, relatively new type of protocol for treatment where you treat the largest blood vessels in your body by way of your neck, and so you essentially use that as a blood treatment kind of systemic impact. You start seeing more nitric oxide, not just locally or regionally, but also kind of systemically. And when you're doing that, you actually uh, you you kind of train your endothelial tissue to be able to expand and contract more effectively. One of the things that we see with aging is that your cardiovascular endothelial tissue will stiffen, and we measure this with a metric that's called shear strength. So if you think of your blood vessels kind of like a pipe, you have blood going through. It creates friction on the blood vessel, and it could actually rupture if you have too much pressure going through. So when you have higher levels of shear strength, it means that it's typically more flexible and just stronger tissue. So you're not going to have cardiovascular events at the same level from a a mortality standpoint. So when you can increase that level of nitric oxide in your blood, and this can actually be paired with a number of different dietary changes as well. So, there's a number of different things out there from a beets or beet powder and drinks
Okay.
you can have. You can increase the level of nitric oxide that's available, and then you can actually trigger it with the dietary changes, and then trigger it with the laser. So, this is one way where kind of systemic impacts from a cardiovascular endothelial tissue kind of work in an anti-aging way to reduce your risk of ongoing um, cardiovascular endothelial issues. And again, those are typically the start of a mortality curve kind of
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
change.
So, but
Um,
how does it? So, I have many questions. So, and I'm trying to also keep some practical, like, I just sprained my ankle historically. No, I haven't, but let's just say I have, 15 years ago, if I was, or 20 years ago or whatever, if I was playing on a basketball team, be like, throw your foot in the ice boot kind of thing. Like, I guess what's changing? Because it seems like it's almost the opposite. And that's a specific example, but then I don't want to lose the train of thought that you're talking about, like, overall holistic kind of, let's just say, potentially reducing, all cause mortality in a way. And I'm not sure if there are studies there, but like, because I know your product, let's say the ankle, it's very targeted. I'd pop, I'd put the device in the three devices on the ankle and kind of let it work its magic. Versus what you're saying, like full systemic is. Are there other? Is that what you're talking about? The neck, or
yeah.
like how do we do it daily? I guess versus I'm all over the place. Sorry,
No, no.
is there a proactive approach, and what's that look like versus like acute kind of injury? I need, healing, I guess you could say.
Yes.
Sorry, audience.
No, this is it's all great questions, and I could talk about this for hours. So to kind of parse this a little bit, the with an ankle injury, definitely don't ice it because you reduce the growth factors that you introduce into the space, into that kind of local tissue. I've got a paper that I'll link you back to that we've done a summary of the comparisons, and you actually see the histology, kind of the cellular level differences. You'll see the pictures of what happens if you're icing it versus if you're using infrared laser therapy. And with this type of thing, it's night and day. It's so different. And
Okay.
this is one of the things that's changed. The other thing that's changed probably in the last, since I was playing really highly competitive sports, was they also wanted you to stay off of your injuries at that
Mhm.
time, and you don't want to stay off your. There are some that you will, like if you tear your ACL, you don't want to go jogging on that. But
Yeah, yeah.
a sprained ankle movement, non-specific lower back pain movement, sciatica and hip issues and knee issues, movement actually helps it, and they're kind of moving more towards
Interesting.
the motion is lotion type approach to this versus just rest, ice, compression, elevation is really not. Even the initial researcher who published around that has kind of retracted it and said this is. And they have a couple of new acronyms, MEAT and one more that doesn't come to mind. Yeah, but it's yeah, so that's the kind of targeted pieces is you can
Okay.
treat these local areas, and with the idea of sprained ankles is a great one. So the edema and the results that you see from our device on things like sprained ankles are amazing. One of the ones where you might see a slower or kind of longer term impact is, and it's not as amazing. We try to be as upfront and set reasonable expectations for people. This isn't, and it's not magic. It's
Yeah, yeah.
um, is things like osteoarthritis of the hands or the feet. So peripheral kind of improvements from a blood flow and inflammation standpoint. When we have less tissue to interact with, we're just going to be slower on dealing with that. So
Okay.
those. With an ankle, you can see sub 1 week, really kind of night and day differences with things that are more chronic, longer standing, things like osteoarthritis in the peripheral areas. It's going to be more like 5 or 6 weeks, but it just takes more time because there's less tissue for us to interact with.
Yeah. So what is, like, if I think of, I'm just using me as a use case, 'cause I'm sure many have these same things, like, just small little like aggravation in the knee, or not necessarily, well, I guess everything's driven by some sort of event, but this is probably more events from the past that are kind of like coming up and whatnot. And I think I shared this with you, like my whole thing. It's like I really want to be able to mountain bike and snowboard. And sometimes, I can feel it on both of those sports. And like, oh, my knee's like, it's not enough to stop me, but I'm like, I don't want this to become a problem. So is there like, I feel like I saw this on your Instagram where you were using your device actually prior to
Yeah.
a workout, um, which I've been doing it after. Like it's kind of like when I'm done, I throw it on, and I like the fact that it's roughly 10 minutes. I actually stack in some mental fitness there and do some visualization while it's happening. But like, how should we look at using any kind of I forget all the terms again, but red light, or what did you call it? Photo
Photobiomodulation. Yes.
photo modulation. There we
It's a
go.
mouthful.
Yeah, yeah,
Our academics have to have something to kind of disagree about. So the
exactly.
terminology has been one of those things. So you can do it for both. So treating so I will typically treat pre-workout if I'm doing something. I have an old meniscus injury,
Okay, yeah.
and meniscus is funny because it's a cartilage point in your knee that's exposed to the synovial fluid there. And when you injure your tissue, so if you mentioned kind of having old things that might be coming back up, when you've had an injury to tissue, one of the ways that we kind of see that present, and that actually is a good thing to start treating from the laser therapy standpoint, is you'll develop cold pools of tissue. And so we use infrared cameras on some of the athletes we work with, and you can see they tore a muscle. They're in their low 30s, and 10 years ago in their low 20s they tore a muscle in their back, and that you see a cold pool of lack of blood delivery to that tissue, and so the recovery,
Oh,
it makes it easier to re-injure, and it also leaves inflammation in that area, and that inflammation is what triggers that kind of cold pool. Like the
yeah.
inflammation impacts your cardiovascular tissue in a way that kind of constricts it. So what we can do with that is we can kind of treat these over roughly 4 to 6 weeks, and then we see that tissue temperature level out, and it's training through this release of nitric oxide and the kind of dilation of the blood vessels. It's training that tissue to deliver blood more effectively to itself again. And so
So is that daily for us? Like 10 minutes a day kind of thing
it
for
should,
4 to 6 weeks?
I think,
Yeah,
yeah, for those results, yes.
yeah.
When, and it should also be ongoing, because you can actually see, when you have, traumatic tissue damage, like my meniscus issue in my knee, what happens is that's kind of encompassed by the synovial fluid, and the old injuries trigger inflammation, and that inflammation, kind of chronic inflammation, triggers a degradation of the soft tissue. So you see your ligaments, and particularly your cartilage, start to degrade at a faster rate. And so
Hmm.
there should be kind of homeostasis of, we're regrowing new tissue and we're degrading old tissue, and it should be at a balance. But if you have these old injuries and that inflammation in the joint, then what you'll find is that it puts that homeostasis out of kilter, and you're actually seeing that cartilage thin down over time. And when you see kind of at middle age, people are starting to have like these creaks and aches and things. Part of what's happened there is that degradation factor. You're starting to see the front end of osteoarthritis,
Yeah.
and if you
Which you don't have to accept. That's like, I'm so tired of that. I mean, there's so many people, my mother included, in the family, that is just like, it's just a part of aging, and it's like, some of it, but most of it probably not. Like we don't have to just accept that we're not going to be able to move when you're like in your 60s. I mean, that's crazy.
you definitely should not. And if you're starting to feel it, get ahead of it. Like the sooner you
Yeah.
can start using things like this. There's also a number of supplements that you can kind of back this with. We one of the things that we see is if people are using collagen peptides,
Okay.
and then there's a couple of other, without going too far in the weeds on this, there's a couple of other supplements that I can kind of pass you papers for, that work really synergistically with the laser therapy. And what you see is that when you reduce that inflammation and that cause of that ongoing degradation of the cartilage, and you increase these kind of ingredients, for lack of a better term, of this soft tissue, your body will put them together. You'll increase human growth factor in the area. You'll increase the proliferation for type 2 collagen, and you'll also increase the
Mm.
proliferation of these fibroblasts, which are essentially the fast growing front end cells of your cartilage. And so this isn't kind of overnight. The inflammation reduction is very fast, relatively, days to weeks scale. But when you do have that inflammation reduction and you are supporting yourself from a colostrum, collagen, and a couple of these different supplements that you can use in kind of conjunction with the laser therapy, what you find is that you'll start rebuilding at a faster rate. So you kind of go out of that negative homeostasis back into a positive one, and you can rebuild your cartilage around this. And that's a month scale process to set
Yeah.
reasonable expectations for people. But it means that when you're going from, for me, 45 with a meniscus tear, I like you said, I don't want to be, at 60 and have a more limited mobility because of that, because it really is a big impact for your mortality, um, and also just your
Yeah.
quality of life. Move, take the correct supplements, reduce inflammation in your diet as well, and then apply the laser therapy. And you have 10 years. Like, if you think about this as a marathon, not a sprint, you can really invest in improving the quality of the soft tissue all over your body.
Yeah. What I love about the way, like, I love the accessibility of at least what you guys have created, that, like, it's 10 minutes. I mean, just stack that into something like, I don't know, maybe you're watching, 30 minutes of Netflix or something at the end of the day. Like, just pull up your pant leg, and slap that on your knee. And it's so simple, right? Like, you can easily do that daily. And I heard you talk, I think you were speaking to Ben Greenfield about this, something about inflammation, not because I think we all think like, okay, we've been talking about the knee as an example right now, but that inflammation, like, it spreads or something like that, right? It's not. Can you explain a little bit more? Because I remember you talking to Ben about that. I'm like, holy shit, I had no idea that is like, can be a universal challenge now.
Yeah, it's actually the first thing that kind of pulled that onto our radar was we work with a number of different NFL players, and as a study, 5 to 10 years ago, on a cohort of around 3,500 NFL players, and big study, Harvard-based study, and they found, after washing out, like, and we get a question a lot about the data, so I'll just go ahead and address that up front. So I'll describe this first and then address the kind of washout process they use from a data standpoint. They found that the players who had an ACL tear in their career, um, had a 50% increased experience of severe cardiovascular events, so heart attacks, strokes, etc.
Oh,
And that's a lot to parse, and it's multivariate. But one of the big variables on this is that you're just generating ongoing. You think like, oh, I had my ACL tear, I had a surgery on it, it's fixed
yeah,
now. What you've had is traumatic tissue damage, and then surgery, which is traumatic tissue
yeah,
damage, and you
yeah.
have a small generator of inflammation that doesn't. And again, this wasn't something that was on our radar until we start looking into this further. But you have that, both kind of locally, and then when they measured, with these athletes, what how is that affecting them, kind of regionally and systemically, you would see that the tissue in the quad above that ACL, when it had been torn, even 10 years later, that tissue in the quad would be 2 degrees, 1.5 to 2 degrees colder. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but it's massive from a blood flow delivery standpoint. And what it indicates is that inflammation has been trickling out both regionally, because we're seeing that kind of impact on the level of blood flow delivery to the quad, but also systemically. And that's one of the things where we start looking at measures like this, um, the kind of flexibility, or the shear strength of the cardiovascular endothelial tissue, and their cardiovascular tissue was stiffer. They just weren't delivering blood as effectively to these areas, and there's no, like, as far as we know, at least from what we've seen from the literature, there's no other way of treating your cardiovascular endothelial tissue that's going to train it back into more effective delivery of blood
Yeah.
that's better or even competes even in the same order of magnitude as laser therapy. So this is one thing where we've seen a really big impact for that. That the shear strength is just an amazing one, and there's better literature on it now. And it keeps getting dialed in over the years, but it's really powerful. And again, in line with our mission as a company, because we feel like if we're able to give people additional kind of years of functional life, that's how else could you measure kind of the quality of life than that health span? So this
Yeah.
is kind of right in our wheelhouse.
I feel like this is I mean, when I first heard it, I was quite blown away. Then now listening to you describe it in a little more detail, I, I feel like that's a huge, huge piece of information. Because if I think of myself as well as like, again, a lot of the listeners of the show, like we're motivated, we're trying to be as healthy as we can. And I would put myself in this bucket. It's about to change because now I've got a little bit more data from you and some practical use cases. But like I'm not really thinking of the old injuries like until they're actually bothering me
Yeah.
from that standpoint, right? But at the same time, like we're focusing on other things to try to be as healthy as possible, and this is like a little sleeper, that can be a huge problem if we don't address it. So, and I love that we like okay, well we do have some solutions here that are actually quite accessible.
Yes, finally, it's great
Yeah,
because again,
that's so
if you're
cool.
able to add that in with the kind of beats powder or these different things that support from a nitric oxide cycle, and then be able to trigger it locally, then you have a kind of systemically like synergistic way to go approach this, and it's
Yeah.
one more that you might like, and I think it came up
Ooh.
kind of in a orthogonal or ancillary way a moment ago, but um, with kind of proactive approaches for these type of things as well. Um, we work with a Japanese lab that's developed a new type of protocol. And I mentioned about treating the kind of largest blood vessels in your body to treat the blood, kind of to help treat yourself systemically. This is called the proximal priority therapy, and
Okay.
the test results on this are just like almost mind blowing. We came across this lab and have been working with them for the past 6 months or so. Based on we're developing, we'll launch a femtech product next year that essentially helps treat endometriosis, infertility,
Wow.
and perimenopause, menopause, and dysmenorrhea, and kind of period pains, kind of menstrual pains. Um, and as part of that research around this lab was doing something they call remote photobiomodulation, which is a kind of a new segment of the research into photobiomodulation. And what that means is essentially treating tissue in one part of the body to trigger an effect somewhere else. And it just kind of give you a couple of data points on the research paper, the randomized control trial that triggered our team to look into it and to reach out to them. They had 229 women in Japan who had been infertile for at least 5 years, start doing this proximal priority therapy on their neck. So essentially, kind of just using as a blood dosing methodology.
So would just visually, so would this just be placing the lasers around the neck?
Place the laser around the neck and using two of them vertically over your carotid, essentially. So, uh,
Okay.
and I can.
I got a whole routine at night coming up here.
So so they saw 28% of these women get pregnant in 8 months, and 22% of them carry that through to a healthy delivery, which is just they weren't expecting that. It's an insanely high number, and I think part of that was there's a yeah, it was all centered around inflammation without going too far into it.
Yeah.
But it also triggered our team to go look at if you're triggering kind of fertility changes in ovarian and uterine tissue for women, this is going to be triggering a lot of other things in the body. And so, from a performance standpoint, we've been looking at it. There's a number of things that you can use laser therapy for on the gut. For an example, with this remote photobiomodulation for immune health.
Mhm.
And
Yeah, you're working on
this,
the gut, right? I think
that's right. That's
you've
right.
got
A
something
lot.
coming. Yeah.
Yes. we're launching a gut product next year, and it's super exciting because your gut is just at the center of so many things
Yeah.
from a health and wellness standpoint, particularly the connection to the brain. And it's a huge generator of neurotransmitters for your body as well. So one of the things that we've been testing with our early beta products from the gut is pairing it together with this proximal priority therapy. So we're treating blood and now we're treating gut. And when you can reduce inflammation by way of treating the blood systemically, and then one of the things that we see just based on human kind of the modern human diet and kind of stress levels is so many people have leaky gut that don't really realize this. And those tight junctions in your gut, when they start opening up, you continuously leak inflammation and inflammatory markers into the rest of your body. And when you can
Nice.
start kind of sewing those up a little bit and kind of tightening those tight junctions, there's some really powerful impacts, both from, again, neurotransmitter standpoint, increased dopamine production, increased serotonin production, acetylcholine, like a number of different things that really just help you feel better. And just from my kind of personal end of one kind of um, my own, and again, grain of salt, this isn't an exact study, but I was doing that for 2 weeks before I started seeing those actual differences from like in the studies, they call it affect. What it really means
Yeah.
is just your mood and your kind of sense of well-being.
So where do you place it? Like, what's that visually look like?
So essentially, just below across and just below your kind of horizontally across your belly, just below your navel, and
Okay.
the impacts
So you
that
guys are just doing like a different strap, I guess, to hold the, or
we've
is it,
been using.
or
Yeah,
if
sorry.
you can't talk about it, that's okay
No,
too.
no, no.
But
It's great. It's great. It's a great question. So we started using our initial device, the Move Plus, to do this because the 808 nanometer actually has an impact here as well. The red doesn't. It doesn't really penetrate through enough to be able to kind of impact this area of the body. But what we found with we build these mathematical models called Monte Carlo models, which essentially show how the photons distribute through tissue. This is how we build our optimal dosing models and how we kind of engineer our products.
okay.
We found through our models that if we added in with the 808 a 940 and a 1064 wavelength, that we could actually dose more effectively into the gut. So that's where we're going with our new product.
Oh, I
And we've
see.
been kind of testing doses. We try to build based on the mathematical models. We build product. We test how that works in the physiology, whether it's through kind of blood studies or poop studies in the
Yeah.
case of the gut, and validate this from a data standpoint. And then we say, okay, we were expecting from our models this, but what we're actually seeing in the outcome is this. So where did we go wrong and how do we dial this in? And we just continue to cycle that for continuous improvement of the dosing. So when we
Mm.
dose like this for the gut, you see the inflammation reduce. You see, people with irritable bowel syndrome and Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis really have powerful impacts from a change and these are 1 to 2 week time frames. So I was going to say overnight, but that's a little
Yeah, but
hyperbole.
that's pretty
Yeah.
quick.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
And their immune function goes through the roof. And what we know about this is that we see this ABC. So how do we dose it? And then we see the XYZ of like what the outcomes are. But what's really happening and what's so exciting from the kind of research around the space is that we're starting to fill in these letters in the middle. Like what's actually triggering this? So we're
Yeah.
triggering increased levels of so short chain fatty acids are a kind of byproduct of like butyrate and a couple more are a byproduct of healthy gut bacteria and a healthy gut biome. And we see increases in this. We see decreases in kind of systemic inflammation markers. But the big thing is we also just see, and these are still very small and observational from our standpoint. It exists in the medical literature, but kind of anecdotal, for me as an example, I got the two kids. They drag in all kind of stuff from school.
This is exactly what I'm thinking right now. It's like, how do I get this product ASAP?
I haven't been sick in 6 months. I've been doing the proximal priority on the neck and then the gut treatment and like so my affect, it took 2 weeks to kind of really notice this. And I do similar to you. I kind of meditate and try to keep notes on my general affect on a daily basis and then track
Yeah.
that against a couple of different things that we do from a testing standpoint. my affect went through the roof after 2 weeks. My sleep improved, and my immune health. I haven't been sick in 6 months, which is just, again, grain of salt, anecdotal, but
Yeah.
we
But the
we are.
time of year, especially with school, like, yeah.
But we're also
Right.
doing up some very good medical studies on based on this, because we're, with our small kind of observational studies, we're seeing such powerful anecdotal changes for everyone who's using this, that it's not everyone. I would say we're around 10% non-responsive for it, and we're digging into the reasons for that. But what we try to do is be as transparent as possible and say, like, here's what we're seeing, and so there is a potential that you're non-responsive, and then we go back and try to diagnose and solve why they're non-responsive.
Holy smokes. So, I mean, so I guess we're technically out of time here. I could speak to you for another hour. This is just it's so fascinating. I mean, we might have to have a round two at one point, and maybe when the other products are coming out, and the study and the research is also developing, can kind of do some updates and whatnot. But I mean, just off the top, I mean, thank you so much for bringing your level of knowledge, and I can see what your hobby is in research and science and whatnot. Like, it's clear, that's coming, quite clear in this conversation. But at the same time, I think, like, some of this stuff for me is a little bit over my head, but in general, and I hope the audience, and I imagine they're getting the same thing. In general, I think we're all left with some good questions to be asking, and also, I think, for me at least, was left feeling quite hopeful that, because there's so much, when it comes to our health these days, that it's like, oh man, like, we're getting poisoned all over the place with just the chemicals and this and that. And there's so much out there that it almost feels like there's a lot out of our control. Whereas I feel like everything we talked about today is actually very accessible, and you're seeing results fairly quick as well. I mean, as long as you're consistent, of course, and whatnot. And man, that feels motivating. So, I mean, thank you for you and the team for doing this work.
Thank you so much for having me on here. I hope I didn't go. I get really excited about it, and didn't go just talking after rabbit holes. Really appreciate this. Anytime you'd love to talk, I'm here. And hopefully we can get you through Mexico sometime to come see us down there as well.
Marketing is hard. But I'll tell you a little secret. It doesn't have to be. Let me point something out. You're listening to a podcast right now, and it's great. You love the host. You seek it out and download it. You listen to it while driving, working out, cooking, even going to the bathroom. Podcasts are a pretty close companion. And this is a podcast ad. Did I get your attention? You can reach great listeners like yourself with podcast advertising from Libsyn Ads. Choose from hundreds of top podcasts offering host endorsements, or run a pre-produced ad like this one across thousands of shows to reach your target audience and their favorite podcasts with Libsyn Ads. Go to libsynads.com, that's LIBSYN, ads.com today.